3, 2.
All right, guys. Hey, everyone. I'm Steve Pergam. I'm an infectious disease physician and the director of infection prevention at the Seattle Cancer Care Alliance. And I'm here today for a flu talk with Dr. Helen Chu and Dr. Jessie Bloom. Helen, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, Steve. I am also an infectious disease doctor. I work at Harborview Medical Center, which is the county hospital downtown, and I study flu vaccines, mostly in pregnant women and in infants.
And I'm Jessie Bloom. I'm a PhD researcher in the Basic Sciences Division here at the Fred Hutch, and my lab researches evolutionary biology, and one of the things that we study a lot is the evolution of flu virus.
Great. So, one of the important things here is we wanted to do a couple things today. We want to talk about sort of things we can do to prevent flu. We're going to talk a little bit about flu vaccine in general. But we also wanted to talk some science because, all of us are doing research in this area, and I think it's important to understand why that happens. And, I was sort of interested, Jessie, when we first met, why is a flu person working at a cancer center? Maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'm here in the Basic Sciences Division at the Fred Hutch, and so one of the things that the Basic Sciences Division does is just do research in all areas of biology, because often studying areas of biology that aren't directly relevant to cancer will end up leading to insights that are important to cancer. In my case, I started studying viruses, especially influenza virus, because I was interested in evolution, and they evolve rapidly, and that work has sort of naturally progressed to studying the evolution of flu and working with people like Steve who do infection control.
Yeah, it's actually really interesting. One of Jessie's PhD students did a study looking at evolution of flu in cancer patients, and one would think that would be very different than the general population, but that data was quite unique in some of the outcomes in terms of what it was related to the general public. So I don't know, can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so this was a really cool study that sort of involved bringing together some of the sort of more clinical work and really monitoring of immunocompromised cancer patients that Steve and his collaborators had done, with really looking at some basic questions having to do with flu evolution. And what we did in this particular study is we took advantage of the fact that Steve and his collaborators had collected over time samples from immunocompromised patients who had very long flu infections, and we then took those samples and used new sequencing techniques to see how the virus was actually evolving in these infected people. And what we found, which was really quite remarkable, is that a lot of the evolution that you saw within these individual flu-infected people was sort of a microcosm of what you see when you look at the evolution of the virus at a global scale. So I think that's showing that many of the same selection pressures that operate on the virus within an individual person are similar to those that operate as the virus circulates among many people across the globe.
Yeah, it's interesting. Flu is a fascinating organism, partially because it not only affects the general public, but cancer patients, it's a big risk, and so we think about this quite a bit. I'm curious, studies that you guys have done at Harborview and other places, how often does flu happen in the general public?
That's a great question. I think flu or flu-like illness is pretty common in people who come in to see their primary care doctors, and then also in certain individuals who are high risk, like those with chronic lung disease, women who are pregnant, people who are Alaska Native, morbidly obese. There are certain high-risk categories where these people are more likely to get quite sick, to have progression of their flu from just being a cold or just feeling kind of crummy down to a pretty severe pneumonia, and then sometimes they get secondary bacterial infections as well, and they end up in the hospital. And at Harborview, surprisingly, we see lots of cases of flu that goes on to intensive care unit hospitalization, where they get intubated and they end up on breathing support.
Yeah, I think the CDC report last year was a bad season, H3N2 in particular. What was interesting is I think the estimations were about 80,000 people in the United States died of flu or flu-related complications. Right. So it's a disease that I think we should all take seriously, for sure. So why do you guys think, can you tell me a little bit about seasonality? Why is this, sort of such an interesting phenomenon for me? I think you've done some work in Nepal where flu is actually not seasonal, it's year-round. Maybe, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we did a large trial in Nepal from 2011 to 2014 where we looked for flu in pregnant women and in infants, and then did a trial of flu vaccine in pregnancy to see if we could prevent flu in the mothers, flu in the infants, and then also reduce risk of low birth weight. And we knew that flu did circulate year-round in the tropics, but what we found was that it actually circulated 9 out of 12 months of the year, so that there were only 3 months of the year, 1/4 of the year, where there wasn't flu there, which made it actually very challenging to figure out what vaccine to give in the setting of our trial, and also what vaccine we would give if we were sort of to make this national policy. So if you imagine, if you're on the equator, then you have to switch between northern hemisphere vaccine, which is available certain times of year, and then southern hemisphere vaccine, and then being able to sort of toggle back and forth with the availability of getting vaccine to these places was very challenging. It wasn't just one type of flu that circulated year-round. We saw H3N2, we saw H1N1, and we saw both types of B, and they just went back and forth throughout the course of the entire year over the course of 3 years.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because we have to choose these vaccines. So a lot of times the WHO and other organizations get together and make the decisions about how to do this. And we've seen at least, usually we get some predictions about what's going to happen by what's going on in Australia and some places in Asia. And so far, at least, it hasn't seen as severe this year so far. And oftentimes we see sort of a little bit of a decrease after a big H3N2 season. But I would not encourage anybody to think that might be how it goes. We never know. Can you maybe you guys could describe a little bit, how's the vaccine changed this year? I mean, I think there's 2 new components that I know. I think it's, what is it? I wrote this down just because I can never remember specifically. There is a new H3N2 strain that's a Singapore strain this year, and then there's a new B strain that's a Colorado strain that looks like it's a little bit of a better match. And it's always hard to tell what the match looks like. But if people want to follow sort of how flu changes over time, I think you guys have both probably seen Trevor Bedford, who's a faculty member at Hutch, has a really nice website called Next Strain, where you can go and look at H3N2 or H1N1 and see how they change over time. And part of his research is really organized at trying to predict what will happen over time with flu vaccine. And I know he's worked a lot with WHO and others to try to anticipate what this is going to be, but it's a challenge, and it's always hard. We don't know how things are going to change over time. Yeah. So do you guys get your vaccine every year?
I get my flu vaccine every year, and I'm actually hoping to do it today. For those people who work at the Hutch, I believe they're giving the vaccine starting at 11 a.m. in the East Lake building, so we're very fortunate that they offer the vaccines here.
Yep.
And one of the things as flu researchers that we worry about is the flu vaccine is not as effective as some other vaccines, like for instance the measles vaccine or things like that, but it's still, there's a lot of evidence that the flu vaccine is better than nothing, and so I definitely get the vaccine.
Yeah, no question. We all get it. I think what's important also is that if you get the vaccine, even if it's not a perfect match, that it may help prevent severe illness. So really key is that even if it doesn't prevent you from getting flu, getting the vaccine can really decrease the risk of you having major complications. And if you look at the people who typically get into real trouble, it's people who either don't get good vaccine responses or people that are not vaccinated.
The other thing to emphasize is that since we're both healthcare workers and we see patients, we get vaccines not only to protect ourselves, but to protect our patients. And that's an important point as well. So if you live in a house with somebody who's at high risk and who's not able to respond to the flu vaccine, it's really important for you to vaccinate yourself so that you prevent transmission to that person who would get quite sick from their flu.
Yeah, and we actually, I totally agree with you on this, because at the Seattle Cancer Care Alliance, which is the clinical arm of Fred Hutch, a lot of times we've been concerned that family members can be a pathway for infection, because you sleep in the same household, you spend time together much more closely than you do in just walking around the community. And so we've actually given free flu vaccine to caregivers and families, because we really believe that's one of the best ways to prevent it. It's a good point.
Yeah, and there are classic studies like the Seattle Virus Watch study, which was done in the 1960s and 1970s, which have shown that family members are really the ones who transmit flu to each other. That really, the first people to bring it into the house are sort of the school-age children, and then once they bring it in, then it just spreads like wildfire within the house, and then affects the ones who are going to get sick, like the infants or the elderly. So.
Yeah, that's true.
Or the immunocompromised.
Right. We don't really talk about influenza B too much, but I'd be curious, what you guys know of. It's kind of an interesting virus. It doesn't have as much change. Maybe, can you describe? Is the structure a little bit?
So influenza B, there's 2 main types of influenza. There's actually three types of influenza that infect humans. There's
Yes.
influenza A, influenza B, and influenza C. And then
Right.
there's a large variety of, or there's a growing number of other related viruses that have been discovered in other animals, but those are the only ones that infect humans. So we don't worry so much about influenza C because it doesn't cause substantial disease in humans, but influenza A and influenza B both cause diseases in humans. And one of the big differences is that influenza B is really a human virus. It's adapted to humans. Humans are the primary host, and it's sort of reached it's a little bit closer to evolutionary equilibrium with us. Influenza A actually isn't a human virus, really. So although we have influenza A, this is H1N1 and H3N2 circulating in humans, this is a virus that's really naturally adapted to wild waterfowl, and then it infects a number of other species, including pigs, horses, dogs, domestic poultry, and humans. So one of the reasons that as a field you often have heard more about influenza A is these extremely severe influenza pandemics, which happen periodically, the most famous happening in 1918, all involve influenza A because those are sort of foreign viruses jumping from another species into humans.
Yeah.
So there's more focus on influenza A because sort of the potential catastrophic downside of having something like another 1918 pandemic. Influenza A poses that sort of risk. Influenza B doesn't really. But in a typical season, most years we're not having a 1918-like pandemic, fortunately. And so in any given season, influenza B can cause a substantial amount of morbidity in the human population as well. And Helen is more knowledgeable about this than me, so I'll let her speak to this. But I think this is especially true in younger children. Is that correct?
That's right. So influenza B can cause severe disease in any population, but especially in young children, it's been shown to cause more severe outcomes, including things like encephalitis or inflammation of the heart, so myocarditis, and things like that we were very worried about as sort of secondary complications of your primary infection.
So I think it's really important when you get your vaccine that it does include A components and B components. And generally what's recommended now is the quadrivalent vaccine, which is 2 strains of A and 2 strains of B, which can be quite protective. And I think that can help prevent some of these side effects, particularly for the immunocompetent patients and young kids.
Yeah.
And interestingly, influenza A is not as well treated with some of the agents that we use influenza B is not as well treated. It's a little more resistant to oseltamivir, which is a common treatment, or Tamiflu, which is the typical drug that we use. So I think it's an important aspect to consider that influenza B is, I think, becoming a bigger issue than we thought. So I don't know, guys, there are questions from the community in general. We just wanted to start the conversation off, and we'll so how long does it take the vaccine to make full effect, and how long does it last? You want to take that, Helen, or you want me to?
Yeah, sure.
Go ahead.
So usually we think of 2 weeks as sort of the benchmark. So you get your vaccine, and then in about 2 weeks you get your what's called a 4-fold antibody response to vaccine. So your body mounts the immune response to the vaccine, and then it's protected from that point on. We think of it as lasting through the season, so for approximately 6 months or so. So every year you do need to be revaccinated to be protected against the flu that's circulating that year.
Yeah, and generally what the CDC recommends is being vaccinated by October 31st. And the reason that's true is we can never predict when flu will arrive on our shores. We do have the ability now to fly long distances to places where flu is endemic, and we can bring it back any place. So right now, I think when I looked at the CDC map most recently, there was some increased rates in Nevada, some on the East Coast, more on the East Coast. So you can never know. But a couple years ago, flu was really early here in early November. So I think it's important to go out and get your flu vaccine as soon as you can. Again, to protect yourself and protect the people around you.
Yeah,
Another question?
and I think that we are seeing flu now as well in the hospitals. We've seen a couple of cases at Harborview now. I don't know if you've seen any here.
We've seen a couple, yeah.
Yeah, so flu is here, surprisingly, already in October here in Seattle. So.
Yeah, so keep in mind it's already happening. We're starting to see cases in the community, so I think it's really important to go out and get vaccinated now. A question online is, what makes the flu able to mutate to avoid a cure so frequently? I think that's right up your alley.
Okay, so I'll answer that as an evolutionary biologist. I can answer that question. So one thing I'm just going to sort of explain as a way of answering this question is something that's very important to distinguish in biology are the concepts of mutation and evolution. We often think of them as the same, but they're actually different. So mutation is important for evolution, and mutation is a process that when the virus copies its genes, it makes some errors. And every organism, including humans, when we copy our genes, sometimes we make errors. But in general, viruses, particularly viruses that have their genomes made of RNA, and flu is an example of such viruses, really make a lot of these mutations. So the rate at which flu makes a mutation at any given position when it copies its genes is many orders of magnitude higher than, for instance, the rate that we would make an error when we copy our genes. But what makes flu evolve rapidly is not just that it has this high mutation rate, this is an important component, but also that once these mutations appear, they're often helpful for the virus. So there are other viruses, for instance, the measles virus also has a very high mutation rate, probably fairly comparable to flu. But yet in measles, those mutations appear, but they don't seem to then help the virus get away from our immunity, so they're not really selected in the virus. And what helps flu evolve so rapidly is first that it has a lot of these mutations, and second, at some non-negligible rate, these mutations actually help the virus escape from our immunity. And possibly part of the reason for this is that the proteins that are on the flu virus have a fairly high capacity to tolerate these mutations, so if the mutation breaks the virus won't be able to evolve.
Sure.
But the mutations don't always break the virus, and sometimes the mutations will help the virus get away from the antibodies that these vaccines and infections elicit, and that's how the virus is able to evolve so rapidly. So the main proteins on the surface of the flu virus are fixing about 3 to 4 amino acid mutations every year, which is just a phenomenal rate of evolution.
Yeah.
It would take millions of years for a single human gene to fix that many mutations.
Yeah. And we even see this in individual hosts, where we see in our immunocompromised patients, we see rapid evolution of influenza to develop resistance to some of the agents because they have high burdens of influenza in compared to the normal host. And so the ability of the flu as it's replicating during active treatment, you actually can see resistance. Usually, I would say as early as 7 days on treatment, we see early resistance develop. So that's an important issue that flu has the ability to escape, and there have been resistant strains against many of the major treatment choices at this point in time. Okay, another question here. How do scientists know what strain to design the next year's flu vaccine for? It's a great question.
Yeah, that is the million-dollar question. And I think we don't know the answer to that, which is why we sometimes have a good match and sometimes we don't have a good match.
Right.
The way that this decision is made is through 2 yearly meetings held in collaboration with the World Health Organization and the Centers for Disease Control, where experts in the field come together and they decide which strain to include in the vaccine for the next year, for the Northern Hemisphere vaccine for here, and then for the Southern Hemisphere vaccine in the South. And that decision is made through a combination of different things. One of the things is looking at what's circulating in the other part of the world.
Correct.
So to predict what's happening in the Northern Hemisphere, we often look at the strains that are circulating in the Southern Hemisphere, and then we choose one.
Yep.
So.
Yeah. But we can't always predict well. Obviously H1N1 was a novel strain that came out of an exposure to animals, likely, and a mutation. And so sometimes we can't predict when these things show up, and that's where pandemics come from. Maybe describe a little bit of that. It's that recombination of these viruses.
So to go to Steve's question and Helen's answer, there's sort of 2 questions when predicting the flu vaccine. As I described a little while ago, influenza A actually isn't really a human virus in a long-term evolutionary sense. It's a virus that lives in other species, and it occasionally jumps into humans. So about 95 to 99% of the time, the strain of flu that we will have, I guess over the last century it's been about 95% of the time, the strain of flu that we will have in any given season is a strain that's a little bit different than the strain we had before. So this is what we're trying to design the vaccine against, because we know that most years the strain that was last year is going to be the strain this year, and it's still a challenging problem. We have to figure out exactly which variant of the strains last year is going to be the dominant one, but at least we have a chance of getting it right. But occasionally, and this has happened in 1918, 1957, 1968, and 2009, one of these flu viruses from an animal species can jump into humans, or at least some of its genes can jump into humans, because as Steve pointed out, these viruses can reassort and swap their genes. And that's extremely hard to predict, because unlike the sort of standard vaccine selection, it's a very random event. So in 2009, despite all the effort we put into studying flu, it caught everyone completely by surprise that this virus from a swine, this flu virus from a pig, jumped into humans. And in those cases, our vaccine will initially be almost useless, because that's a totally different strain. And then the race is to see how quickly can we produce a vaccine, and can we produce it before the virus is spread around the world.
And the World Health Organization does have sentinel surveillance sites, so they have these sites in different parts of the world where they test flu that's circulating in populations that are not human, so in swine and in waterfowl,
It's
or the
really
natural
important.
hosts, and in chickens. So there is an attempt to try to predict what is the next strain that's going to jump into the human population and cause the next pandemic. But obviously, it's very hard to predict.
Yeah.
So.
And we have seen some strains that are out there that make people concerned. Obviously, bird flu has been one that's been a concern. We've seen H7N9, which are two novel strains basically in China. Luckily, so far, there hasn't been a lot of human-to-human transmission of those events. Those seem to be isolated. But there are some hotspots that we worry about, particularly where this could show up. Although Mexico was sort of a surprise, I think, for all of us. Another question here. What's a para-influenza, and how is it different from regular old flu? Is it flu-light?
Is it flu-like?
No.
I wish it were.
I wish it were, exactly.
Yeah.
That's not the case at all.
No, I mean, often when people say I have the cold or I have a flu, what they mean is they feel kind of crummy and they have a fever and muscle aches, but a lot of viruses and bacteria can cause those same sorts of symptoms. So parainfluenza is happens to be one of those viruses. Parainfluenza, we also think of RSV, which causes pretty severe disease in babies. It's the #1 cause of hospitalization of infants in the United States.
Yep.
We also think of human metapneumovirus. There are a lot of other viruses, coronavirus, rhinovirus. All of these can cause you to feel sick and have symptoms that are very similar to flu. So if you get your flu shot and then you still develop an illness which makes you feel crummy and you have a fever, you may very well have one of these other viruses.
Yeah, that's really important. So paraflu isn't influenza. I think it was named probably because it was similar to flu but different. One thing that's unique about parainfluenza is it's not seasonal. It happens all year. And so we have different parainfluenza strains that come and go during the season. And they can be quite severe, actually. In immunocompromised patients and cancer patients, for sure, we've seen very severe illness from parainfluenza. Unfortunately, in parainfluenza, there is no vaccine. So the influenza vaccine you normally get does not protect against paraflu. And right now, we don't have good treatments for it. So we basically treat people symptomatically. It's really difficult. But I think a lot of these viruses, we're still searching for answers for how to treat them. And I think we're even discovering new ones now. Metapneumovirus was relatively new the past few years.
2001.
And I think we've really seen some severe cases of people with metapneumovirus. I think it's been one of the worst ones I've seen more recently.
There's a lot of vaccine development right now
There is,
for these other respiratory viruses. There are probably about 50 vaccines in the pipeline for RSV, a couple that are in phase 3 trials. And then we think of human metapneumovirus and parainfluenza is actually the next major targets after RSV for vaccine development.
And there are a few new treatments that are coming down the pipeline too. I mean, I know for flu, we've got baloxavir, which is the newest agent on the block that recently was published as a kind of an exciting new addition. And I know there's others in the pipeline. So I think flu's got a little bit of some choices there, but these other drugs are farther down the pipe for paraflu, metapneumo, and RSV for sure.
Yeah, I sort of think of the future of these antivirals as having a major role in say, a pandemic.
Yes.
So were there to be a new virus that were to enter the Seattle region, and we need to suddenly stop its transmission, we would be using a combination of these antivirals to block, to lower viral load, and then to lessen the risk of transmission to other populations.
Yeah, so baloxavir I think has that real exciting role from that perspective. I think combination therapy eventually will be something that we'll be talking about with that as well.
And then the real challenge, though, with drugs against flu, including baloxavir, and this is a special challenge with flu that's not always the case with other viruses, is that the way that flu replicates is often by the time you're starting to feel sick, the virus has reached almost the peak replication. So obviously a drug works, the drugs like these stop the virus from replicating. So if you take the drug very early on, it's going to be quite effective, and it's going to get less effective the more the virus is already replicated. And so something that makes drugs against flu very difficult to take, not in controlled settings, but actually sort of out there in the real world, is often people don't start taking the drug until they're sick, and depending on the virus, that can be good enough or too late. And for flu, sometimes it's getting close to being too late. So, the drugs are still often effective if you take them later on, but they're much more effective if you can take them earlier, and that's just a hard thing to do for flu because the virus is replicated so much before you feel sick.
Yeah, and I think really important, a good concept to pass on to people that are out there, either cancer patients or others that are going to be getting flu, family members, get seen if you have symptoms during flu season, because it's important that you get started on treatment early. So 48 hours is sort of the general window once your symptoms have started, where the maximum benefits happen with drugs like Tamiflu. If you delay therapy much more, I would still recommend in a high-risk immunocompromised or a person with a weakened immune system to get treated. But sometimes, if you can get in early, you can really limit the chances that you develop more severe symptoms. So a pregnant woman who develops flu, you want to get them on therapy right away because they have a risk of developing more severe complications.
But even if it's in more than 48 hours for these populations,
Absolutely.
we still want to start therapy.
Yeah, I agree. And oseltamivir is a good drug. It's not perfect, but I think if you are sick and you're at risk, you're getting symptoms, go get evaluated by your provider and get started on oseltamivir early or another influenza agent. I think it's important. So a question again, can you explain the vaccine? I think a lot of people believe it has a bit of virus in it, and I recently found that's not necessarily true. Good for you in doing a right amount of research there to figure that out. The flu vaccine, there is one type of flu vaccine that actually has virus, which we can talk about in a minute, but generally this is not, the flu vaccine does not include virus. So if you get the flu vaccine, there's this myth that if you get vaccinated, that you will develop flu from the vaccine, and that's not true. The vaccine is components of the virus, specifically targeted so you will mount an immune response to those proteins on the surface, specifically hemagglutinin and neuraminidase. And that advantage is that way your response can help prevent flu from replicating. You eliminate it by your immune system recognizing it, realizing that it's not supposed to be there, and eliminating it. There is one particular flu vaccine that is a live virus, and that's the flu mist. Do you want to maybe discuss that a little bit? It's kind of an interesting one.
Yeah, so flu mist is a live attenuated flu strain. Attenuated means it's weakened through passaging it and making it less likely to cause disease in humans. What the issue with flu mist was that, so first of all, it was a great vaccine.
Yep.
Kids loved it because you shot it up their nose, no needles. It was really efficacious in early studies that were done in children where it was actually shown to be probably
Superior,
better
yeah.
than regular injectable flu vaccine. The problem is that something happened in the
Yeah.
last couple of years where two things happened. It seemed like flu mist stopped working, and we don't know why. There are a couple of theories about why it stopped working. One of the things is that once you added that fourth component, so once you made it a quadrivalent vaccine, then something about that made it not work so well. But I think the jury is still out about what exactly happened to make flu mist not work anymore. But in the last couple of years, flu mist didn't work, and it's so now we no longer can use flu mist in anyone. Actually, it's not recommended as first line therapy. It's been in the past year. The Centers for Disease
they allowed it to
Control
come back.
have allowed
Yeah.
it to come back, but it's actually really hard to get.
Yeah, it is.
So.
It's hard to find. So it was interesting. I mean, I think part of the interesting piece is how they managed to organize this. It was really a strain that was developed to specifically grow in your nose,
Right.
so it would not replicate. It's colder in colder portions, not in the other portions of your body. So it's really interesting that happens. Another question here is there anything good to take with the first signs of flu? So that's a great question.
So, I mean, I think one thing, I'm speaking as one person who's not actually a clinician here, but one really important thing that goes back to what Steve and Helen were just discussing is particularly if you're a high-risk individual or you're living with people who are high-risk individuals because they're immunocompromised or very young children or something like that, these drugs that we have, which are the best thing to take after you have flu, they're going to work a lot better the sooner you take them. So I would say one thing is to go to the doctor and actually figure out whether you have flu, because as Steve and Helen were also saying, there's also a lot of things that can make you feel like you have the flu that aren't actually influenza.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think in general, when you have a respiratory virus or a cold, one thing that you can really do to help yourself too is, the typical drink lots of fluids, sort of feel better from that perspective. But I think one key piece is if you're not going to the doctor, try to stay home as much as you can, because going out into the community increases your risk for transmitting it to other people. And so, one of the best ways in 1918 to decrease the amount of spread that happened was to close schools and public events and things like that. So, if you're actively symptomatic, it's not great to go to that big conference or to go to that family reunion and spread it around to a bunch of people.
Or to go to work.
Exactly. So we actually really encourage at the Seattle Cancer Care Alliance that our staff, when they're ill, they should not come to work. And we really push that because we don't want that to be spreading to not only patients but also to the other staff, because it can really have a major effect on clinics. So we have strict policies to prevent people from coming in with respiratory viruses. And I think businesses are beginning to realize this more and more. So, there are more and more options to do, sort of computer-based stuff at home. If you can work from home, stay out of public spaces as best you can, and that can really help avoid the spread of flu in the community, I think is another thing to do. So do people get the flu, feel ill after getting the vaccine, or is this a misconception? So I think when people get the vaccine, generally, some people can have symptoms, and those symptoms can vary. Generally, what I've seen most commonly is people complain of soreness in their arm. Some people will say they have sort of flu-like symptoms, but I guess I haven't seen that as much. I think.
So the beauty of randomized trials where you're able to take people and either randomly give them the flu vaccine or something that's not the flu vaccine, and you can observe them for these effects of feeling bad after getting the shot, or arm pain, or nausea, or fevers, or all of these symptoms, is that we actually find that flu does not cause
the flu vaccine.
The flu vaccine does not actually cause these symptoms. That those rates are very similar in the people who got what we call placebos, the ones who got something that was not the flu vaccine.
Yeah, and I think it's really important. Helen pointed this out beforehand, that this often is a mistake, is that people get the flu vaccine and then they still get a cold and they say, see, it didn't prevent it. But there are multiple different viruses that you can have beyond flu that flu vaccine doesn't prevent happening. So it's key to remember that just because you develop a cold or flu symptoms doesn't mean you have the flu. And it's important to go see, go see your doctor, get sorted out what's going on, and if you do have flu, get treated. Even if you had the vaccine, you can still get the flu. It's not 100% effective. And certainly for those who don't respond to their immune system doesn't respond to vaccines very well, cancer and transplant patients, people who have immunocompromised conditions, people on steroids, people with rheumatologic diseases, kidney disease, etc. I think it's really important to get that sorted out. Quick question, in addition to the vaccine, what are good behaviors to try to follow? So what do you guys do to avoid flu every year?
So, wash your hands.
Yeah, there you go.
I was just flying back from the East Coast where I was visiting my brother, and I went through several little containers of Purell. And I think general hygiene, not only for preventing the flu, but also for preventing all of many other things that can make you feel not great, are also good practices. And I think hand washing and when you're in a situation where you can't wash your hands, using the hand sanitizer are good things to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, again, if you're somebody at risk for flu, so what we tell our cancer population is avoid crowded spaces. Maybe if you're going out to dinner with family, choose a time when it's not as crowded, when you might be able to use lots of hand gel. I carry this in my pocket all the time, and I use it all the time. Whenever I travel, I have it with me as well. I do it multiple times. The other thing is you can't avoid all colds and flu. I think the average is Americans get 2 a year,
2 to 3 a year.
Adults.
Mm-hmm.
Kids probably more like 5 to 6.
Right.
I just recently got over a cold myself, and it's because I was just at a big conference, and I'm pretty sure I got rhinovirus at that. But you see, you can't avoid it all, but you can do a lot to help prevent that. And then I think, again, I want to really stress this. If you have cold and flu symptoms, don't go out into the community, because that's the great way to pass things on to other people.
And the other thing is if you are someone who has a weakened immune system, you should probably recommend that people who are having symptoms not visit you.
I think it's a great
So
point.
if you're at a family reunion and there are some kids who are just, have snot everywhere, you should tell them that, that they probably should not come that close to you, because they're the ones who are most likely to give it to you. So.
Yeah, and I even recommend when people tell me, oh, I'm having sneezing, it's just my allergies, I say anyone with respiratory symptoms, sneezing, coughing, sore throat, anything, should stay away from high-risk patients, for sure. So a question, should I get the 3-strain or the 4-strain shot?
Yeah, so that is dependent on your age,
Mm-hmm.
I think what we would recommend. So there are a couple of different points to make here. So the 3-strain versus the 4-strain. So the 3-strain contains the 2 A's, so H3N2, which is what we think of as seasonal flu, H1N1, which is the pandemic flu, and the 3rd strain is going to be a choice of one of the B's. The B's don't change that much, but there are 2 major types. They're called Victoria and Yamagata. And so for older adults, there is this 3-strain version that's high dose, so has higher content of the hemagglutinin, which is the portion of the vaccine that stimulates your immune response. We know that giving that to older adults helps stimulate their immune system more than giving them the regular dose. So in that population, we recommend that older adults get the 3-strain high-dose vaccine. For everybody else, we recommend the 4-strain, the quadrivalent vaccine, which has the 2 types of A and then the 2 types of B.
So I think what's important also is we're looking at the high-dose strain to see if the high-dose vaccine to see if it might be better. So we're actually doing a study at Fred Hutch and SCCA in bone marrow transplant patients in collaboration with colleagues at Vanderbilt, Northwestern, and University of Alabama, Birmingham, where we're giving patients who are finished or have completed their transplant both high-dose vaccine versus a standard vaccine. So high-dose trivalent vaccine, there are 3 types, versus the standard dose quadrivalent to see if it can have a better immune response.
Yeah.
My guess is the early data from a prior publication suggests that it may be better.
To get the high dose?
Yeah, but we just don't know yet. So I think this study is really important. It's sponsored by the National Institutes of Health, and I think will really help us to inform for these high-risk patients, are these higher level vaccines better?
Yeah, and it may be very soon that becomes irrelevant if there's a new 4-strain
That's
high-dose
right.
vaccine.
Which
is
I
in
don't,
development.
yeah, it's in development. It's not there yet, but I think that's something that'll be really important. I know that some of the companies that are creating these vaccines have been working hard to get that 4th strain in.
Mhm.
So if you've never gotten the flu shot, why should I start now? I think that's a pretty good one. It's a great question, first of all. So my sense is always, you never know when flu will affect your life. And then there's a really nice report if people want to go to NPR about somebody who didn't get a flu vaccine and had a severe event last year, was put in the ICU as otherwise a normal, healthy person. We've had people in our own system who've had loved ones that have developed myocarditis or complications from flu that, made them get a pacemaker, as an example. So there can be some really untoward events that happen even in a normal person. And in fact, many of the cases we see of death are in children. There was a woman, I think in Florida, who's already died this year, who is otherwise normal in her 30s. So there are normal people who get flu who die, and so I think it's really important that whatever you can do to prevent that from happening is important, and can really, if you can protect yourself, getting the flu vaccine can really help you quite a bit. I think it's also important to consider that sometimes that first vaccine can actually be quite beneficial, and so you get a pretty good immune response, and I think you really have the advantage of protecting yourself. And again, I always remind people to remember everyone around them. It's not just themselves, how it protects you, but you have a relatively young newborn at home.
Yeah.
How old is
My daughter's 7 months right now. And
Oh,
she's,
so
she's actually getting
she's actually getting her
second flu
That's right.
vaccine today.
Right.
That's
My
right.
wife
That's
has
right.
the day off, so she's taking her there because for as this is getting a little bit on a tangent.
Yeah,
but
that's okay.
as many of you know, for most vaccines, like when you're getting vaccines when you're a kid, you often get a vaccine and then a booster.
Yeah.
So why do we not typically get a booster when we get the flu vaccine? And the reason is because in general we've had the flu before, both
Or
the
a flu
vaccine
Yep.
and the vaccine before, so
Yep.
we're sort of boosting what we had from the previous year.
Yep.
But when you're a very young child, that's not the case. So you actually get the vaccine she
Twice.
got last month and
Yep.
then the boost.
And I think it's
Yeah.
important that kids under 6 months are not recommended to get the vaccine. So it's a place where people can get in real trouble, as really young kids can get quite sick from
Yeah,
flu.
but you're recommended as a kid to get the vaccine after 6 months,
Yep.
and the reason is because you initially will have antibodies from your mom.
That's right.
And it's known that these pre-existing antibodies interfere, but can be protected, but they also interfere with your response to the new vaccine.
That's
So
right.
waiting until 6 months is the point where mom's antibodies have gone down enough that they're not going to interfere with your ability to respond to the new vaccine, but you're at especially high risk at that.
Yeah, so if you're a pregnant woman, if you get a flu vaccine, you'll be protecting
And
yourself,
and your child.
your fetus,
Mhm.
and your newborn.
That's really good point.
So.
So what do you tell people who are worried about the flu vaccine? Will it actually give them, when they actually think it's going to give them the flu?
That you just shouldn't worry about this. The flu vaccine cannot give you flu. It might make your arm a little bit sore, but it's not going to give you flu. And if you've actually had influenza, you know that it can be a lot worse than having a sore arm. There's lots of ways you can get flu. We talked about
Yes.
these people at
Yes.
concerts, these people at restaurants, these people at work, these people on the bus, but you're not going to get flu from the flu vaccine. It's just not possible.
Yeah. And I think there's always this, sort of concern, I don't want to put things in my body, I'm concerned about this. This is one of the most studied vaccines. It's probably one of the vaccines that's been given the most around the world. It's incredibly safe. So I really, I think there's lots of discussion about sort of potential concerns that people have, but we need to be thinking about the benefits of what this does and how it can protect people. I think it's incredibly important. It's one of the best ways we have, and I think really the best way to prevent influenza from happening in your household or to you and your family.
I mean, one of the
No, keep
One of
going.
the concerns about getting all these vaccines, especially as a young child that comes up, is, it used to be that kids got 3 to 4 vaccines when they were little, and now they get 16 to 20 vaccines. And we know now from looking at sort of the amount of antigen, so the amount of the particles, the infectious particles that are put into these vaccines, that the actual amount of antigen is less now overall in these 16 to 20 vaccines than what was present in those first 3 to 4 vaccines. So the amount of foreign material you're putting into your body overall is actually less.
Yeah.
And it's because we're just getting much better at making vaccines
Yeah.
than we used to be.
Yeah, it's a good point. So I think a couple things, maybe the takeaways that maybe we can think about is wash your hands. As I said, I bring my hand gel with me all the time. Really important. Stay away from crowded places if you can. If you're sick, stay home. I'll repeat that. If you're sick, stay home. Don't come and hang out with us because we don't want to get flu. And then get vaccinated. So I think those are really key points. And then for all of the people on this who are listening in and thinking about their loved ones who have cancer, or if you have cancer, talk to your doctor about getting vaccinated. If you're at the SCCA, tell them you want to get vaccine and we'll get it to you as soon as it's appropriate. And for those family members, just let the teams know and they'll get you vaccinated because it's free within the system. And I think an important aspect for us is we care enough about this that we're giving it to patients' families for free because we know it's a key piece to prevention. So I want to thank you both for being here. I'm going to post a few things on my Twitter page that I'll also loop into the SCCA about some papers that some of the things we discussed today. I'll post something about baloxavir, which is the newer agent. I'll post a really cool new paper that Jesse's group has recently sort of put out on a site called bioRxiv that's going to talk about innate immune responses to flu vaccine, to flu, which is absolutely fascinating. I'll talk about a couple of these other studies we've talked about and link it to both of these guys too. So thank you all for listening, and we appreciate you guys being concerned enough to be focused on flu. Please get your vaccine, wash your hands, stay away from work, and go to see your doctor if you feel sick. Cheers.